So we're going to be talking about first of all, the impacts of COVID-19 and consideration for people managers. This is based on a lot of existing research in organisational psychology. So a lot of the impacts that we'll see aren't too dissimilar from previous research, but there will of course be things that are quite unique to this situation. So we're going to talk about some of the key considerations. We're then going to look at employee wellbeing and stress indicators. So these are some of the things that you might want to look out for as considerations for things that might impact your employees' levels of stress and wellbeing. We're then going to talk about how you can support the return to work, and this is relative to people that have been on furlough or whether you're returning into a physical workspace, and then how you can optimize leadership skills in a virtual environment. And finally, we'll talk about how you can promote conversations around employee wellbeing. We'll talk about some of the practical tools you can use for that as well. So I wanted to start by talking through some of the things that we might expect to see having an impact on people following the last few months. Some of these aren't new, and a lot of this is based, as I said, on existing research, but some of them will probably be more prominent now than others. So it's really important that as people managers, you are aware of some of these things and how they can impact both performance and well-being of your teams so that you can be proactive about mitigating them. So the first thing relates to working from home. And I'm sure many of you can relate to some, if not all of these. Lots of people were forced to work from home, which meant that there really was no time to prepare. So the outcome of this is unsuitable environments. Not everyone has a dedicated home working space. Navigating other people's areas as well. If you're in a shared home space, there's obviously the option of, or there's the consideration of distractions, discomfort, and then a lack of boundaries between work and home. So ability to switch off is really crucial for well-being. And obviously, if we're working in our home environment and we don't necessarily have a suitable space like an office where you can shut the door at the end of the day and go back downstairs and be in your kind of relaxing social spaces, you can tend to get blurred boundaries. And this is something that we've seen and had feedback from a lot of people that they've struggled with. Living with others versus being alone. So navigating other people's space can cause conflict or be quite stressful. But equally, if you're living alone, isolation is also a big risk factor for home workers or virtual workers. And this is where having the workplace is an opportunity to socialize. So if they're not getting rich socialization in their personal life, people will probably look to work to be able to provide that kind of socialization. What I mean by virtual sightlines is that obviously many teams won't have operated in virtual environments before. So in some cases, the use of video conferencing may have been used as a way of surveilling what people are doing work-wise. It's been suggested that this could increase people's level of perceived stress and actually invade their privacy. We'll talk a bit later about the use of video conferencing as a positive tool for virtual teamwork, but it's important to make sure that it's not perceived in a way of keeping tabs on people. And we've recently conducted a few focus groups with management and employee teams and found that particularly for line managers, during the COVID and lockdown, they've wanted to keep in touch with their teams, and part of that has been, scheduling catch-ups regularly, perhaps more regularly than before, and they actually worry that is being seen as micromanagement. So I don't know whether anyone on here has experienced that themselves, but that's another thing. So it's about finding that balance, and it's not always easy, and it will be different for different people. In terms of virtual teamwork, we can draw on previous research, but also need to be mindful of the fact that this situation is really unique. So there aren't that many direct comparisons. But some research on virtual teamwork has found that it can impact helping behaviour. So this is where we as individuals assume that others will be too busy or they won't want to help. But it's actually showed that quite often this assumption is wrong. So really what this calls for is people to be more bold in asking for support. And so sometimes as a line manager, it's your responsibility to really make it clear to your team when you're available, how often you're available to support them, and the fact that you are actually there for support, because and also promoting peer support between team members, because sometimes what can happen is people just assume that they're going to be a burden on someone, or that they're not going to get the support that they want, so they don't ask for it. And as we know, that can just exacerbate problems further. It can increase the risk of conflict and problems with coordination. So obviously miscommunications can happen, especially over things like email or direct message. You have a lack of behavioural and emotional cues, especially when you're relying on things like email and instant messenger. If you don't know the person that well, you might take what they're saying to be harsh or abrupt or rude, when actually that might just be the way that they communicate. So if the relationships aren't there and you're completely talking to each other via messenger or email, it can create the chance of miscommunication and conflict. But also trying to navigate other people's schedules is a lot harder when you're not in a physical environment. So when you're in the office, you can easily turn around to someone, ask if they're free for a catch up, or ask them a question. Now, all of a sudden, we're having to navigate people's diaries, check whether they're free, book time in advance. So that can also affect team creativity, especially when your team is working in a collaborative environment. There's less chance for spontaneous communication, and usually when you have that time to catch up, it has an agenda, so it can really stunt creativity. But on the plus side of that, research has also found that virtual brainstorming can be more effective than in physical environments. So there's a lot of different research out there, but I wanted to highlight those key points. In terms of leadership and management in particular, the impact of shifting to virtual teamwork might have impacted the way that you communicate with and manage your teams. One of those is a potential change in leadership style. So if you were used to working in close proximity to your team in a physical environment, then the sudden shift to working from home might have meant that you've had to adjust your style of management, especially if you have members of your team that you don't know as well, or you might not feel as confident in their ability to work well without supervision. On the other hand, you might have become less available to your team. Remember what we said earlier about people assuming that they shouldn't ask for support. If your team perceive that you are really busy, they might be less inclined to ask for help. Whereas in a physical work environment, you have clear sight lines, and it's easier to navigate. Trust is another consideration, especially without the direct sightline of work, as we kind of mentioned earlier. This again comes down to how confident you feel about not having direct sight of people's work. And obviously different jobs and different companies will have their ways of monitoring work, and things like sales roles or call center jobs are going to be slightly different because there are clearer ways of monitoring people's work. But in a different industry, you might not have that set process and procedure. So it might be down to you to determine how you keep track of people's work. And sometimes that can veer on the side of micromanagement, but sometimes in virtual environments, that is the only way that you can get things done. We know that micromanagement can have the opposite desired effect. So it's just about really trying to get that balance. And then finally, the lack of learning opportunities. So learning and development is a really, really important part for people's well-being and their motivation. If they feel like they're stagnating or they're not getting any feedback or opportunity to progress and learn, it can be really demotivating. When you're in a physical environment, people have the opportunity for indirect learning and development opportunities just by having close proximity with their colleagues, with their managers. But in a virtual environment, because you don't have those sight lines or that level of communication, sometimes those opportunities can be lacking. And we also know as well that sometimes people that work virtually don't get as many learning and development opportunities as people that are in offices. So for example, if your office brings in external speakers, to run training, people that work remotely might not necessarily get that opportunity. I think that potentially the shift to majority of us working remotely is going to change that. You know, we've certainly delivered all of our training online since lockdown. So I think that that's probably going to go in a similar way. But making sure that if some of your staff are looking to you for mentoring, being out of sight of your team can increase barriers to learning, which could impact their engagement. So just be mindful of that. If you've typically been the kind of manager where you've been very hands-on, you've supported your team, you've let them shadow some of the work that you've been doing, how has that been impacted by the shift to working remotely and virtually? Has that impacted you or them? So that's just a question that you might want to think about. Going on to employee wellbeing stress indicators, these are just some key things that are important to remember relative to employee wellbeing. Job demands and resources are probably the job demands resource model is one of the most influential models in organizational psychology relative to levels of stress and well-being. It basically says that if there is an imbalance between the demands placed on an employee and the resources they have to meet those demands, then understandably stress is higher and it can impact well-being. The impact of COVID on job demands and resources could well result in an imbalance between demands and resources, especially if companies have gone through redundancies. If you've got a significant amount of staff who are on furlough, you'll probably have a critical kind of core business team that are still working to keep the company going, but their resources are going to be significantly stretched. Also, if they're working from home and they're balancing schooling of their children, obviously some children are going back to schools now, but some parents are deciding to keep their children at home, there is still that lack of resource there. So I think more than anything, it's just about being mindful of that and understanding that, of course, as a manager, you're probably going to have higher demands and less resources. So unfortunately, that is slightly inevitable for many industries and workplaces, but having that awareness and thinking of ways that you can mitigate those risks and support your staff in other ways is going to be really important. So with higher levels of stress comes a higher risk of burnout. So burnout is emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion as a result of unmanaged demands, essentially. And it's usually referenced to in relation to the workplace, but there is also such a thing as parental burnout and caregiver burnout. Essentially, any demands that you have on you that are too high and you haven't got the ability to deal with them will lead to this burnout. So it's about being able to prevent this from happening, because burnout will lead to subsequent sickness, absenteeism, and so on. Repeated exposure to the media can foster rumination. I think this is there was definitely more of this at the beginning of the pandemic. You know, everyone was looking at the news, they were looking to the daily briefings to get updates on what was happening. And I think that has slowed down now. But now where we're at is seeing a million different media reports about the impacts of for the economy on COVID. There's also a lot of insecurity because we know that lots of companies are having to shut their doors or make people redundant. And of course, there is still the issue of the virus is still going. So some people who are shielding especially or have other underlying health conditions are probably going to be still feeling anxious. So exposing yourself to the media can foster this kind of ruminating thought pattern where you're just constantly thinking about that same thing, and this can obviously impact productivity and also increase feelings of anxiety and stress. So obviously you can't control how much or little people watch the news, but just being mindful of the kind of things that maybe you share within your team, and also just checking in with your team as well, which is going to be really important, and we'll talk about that later. I thought this was quite interesting because there's a lot of research that has looked at the impact of natural disasters on people, and it's shown that 1 year after a natural disaster has occurred, you see increased baseline stress and depression symptoms, which essentially means that people's normal operating levels of stress and symptoms of depression are significantly higher 1 year after a natural disaster. So what that really shows is that there is a lasting impact of these things. And so we shouldn't be thinking about it in the short term of, okay, well, now we're coming out of lockdown and things are starting to return to normal, it's all okay. It's not. These things are going to be felt for the next year or so, and probably longer. So I just thought that was interesting and important to put in. Increased risk of presenteeism. So this is a significant issue that's commonly talked about when we talk about workplace health and well-being and productivity. Presenteeism essentially is people going to work and turning up at work despite the fact that they should probably be staying at home, so despite being ill. And we know that this is a higher rate than absenteeism, and it costs more to employers. And as supervisors, you really have the ability to impact this, because if you are not modeling healthy behaviors, and if you are coming to work despite the fact that you probably should be taking some time off if you're not feeling too good yourself, or if you're working lots and lots of hours outside of the normal, then you're going to potentially increase the risk of presenteeism in your team. And although in the short term it could improve productivity and get things done, in the long term we know that presenteeism significantly predicts subsequent sickness absenteeism and turnover as well. So it's really, really important that you are mindful of how the kind of behaviours that you're exhibiting as managers. It might increase the risk of substance and alcohol abuse. This is also based on research from past kind of traumatic events. It can exacerbate people if they've already got a substance use disorder. Things like this can exacerbate them, and especially if we are working from home, we're isolated, we're feeling unsure about what's going to happen to our jobs. All of these things can exacerbate the risk of developing a substance use and disorder, especially if you've had that in your past. So it might be worth just brushing up on the policies in your workplace on substance use, and seeing what kind of support is available within the organisation to just re-educate people, really. But that is a resulting behaviour of significant stress. So really, as line managers, it's your opportunity to kind of be having these conversations with people during one-to-ones and catch-ups to try and prevent it from getting to that point. Virtual working might also increase workplace loneliness and isolation, as we've said. Obviously, if people are living at home by themselves, they have a higher risk of feeling isolated. But if people aren't having the constant communication or the regular communication with their team, and that communication is limited to things like email and virtual messenger, then it can make someone feel quite isolated. Especially if they don't feel part of the team, or it limits their ability or confidence in feeling like they can ask for help. So this is something that isn't new. Workplace isolation and loneliness is a real risk factor for remote workers. So what does this mean for you as people managers? Well, first off, employee health and wellbeing is more important than ever. I'm sure you have had it drilled into you by now that it has been at the forefront for most businesses for a while, mental health and wellbeing. It's all talked about a lot. But the last few months have definitely shone a light on how important it is to focus on preventative strategies rather than reactive ones. We also know that supervisory support is a key indicator of employee well-being. So as line managers, you do need to feel confident in supporting your teams. This will be a lot easier for some than others, and it is certainly influenced by the quality of relationships you've established with members of your team, and the demands that you have on yourself, and lack of time is kind of a key factor here, and this is one that we've had fed back from various other kind of line manager focus groups that we've run. But there's also going to be a need for flexibility in management practices. The nature of changing environments means that you have had to adapt to the way that you manage people, especially in the current climate. There will be some of you that have teams with people that want to come back into a physical work environment if it's allowed, and some that really don't. And this is another saying that's always used, but a one-size-fits-all approach is not going to work. It's never been recommended, but perhaps now more than ever, it's more important that you're able to think flexibly, even if that means giving up some element of control, which can be quite difficult for us, especially if you've been used to having really kind of not tight reins, but having constant sightlines of your team. If you've been working in a physical environment and now all of a sudden your organisation is saying that from now on we're going to be working virtually, that can be quite unsettling for managers, especially if you, as we said earlier, don't necessarily have that level of trust in your employees. But you have to be sure that that's not impacting the way that you treat people, and you have to be flexible and not treat everyone the same. Clear and transparent communication will be key. I mean, this one is a no-brainer. The most effective leaders are the ones that can motivate their employees. And they do this by clearly communicating a shared vision, but also being really realistic about situations. It might seem easier to try and sugarcoat things to try and protect your teams from feeling uncertain and feeling stressed. But all that does is create distrust and increases barriers and puts more pressure on you as well. Promising job safety while the business is making redundancies, unless you can absolutely guarantee that someone's job is safe, is just the wrong way to go. And it can, and we'll talk about redundancies in a minute, it just fosters feelings of distrust and a lack of commitment. The importance of regular feedback, especially for virtual teams. So have a think about, how does your team know that they're doing well or not well, or what's happening in the company? Sometimes we can assume that because we know something, that means everyone else does. Just because the business has sent out a company-wide email about things, it doesn't necessarily mean that your team has read that. So part of your role as a line manager is giving them that feedback as a team, but also the one-to-one feedback. So, you know, in an office environment, it's a lot easier to turn around and say to someone they're doing a good job for something. In a virtual environment, it's more of a concerted effort to say, just wanted to let you know, good job, or you're doing great. But little things like that, you shouldn't discount them, because they are so important for people. If people don't feel like they're getting feedback, they don't know where they stand, it just can be so demotivating for them. So hopefully all of you do this already, but just have a think about, you know, how good are you with feedback? Are you clearly communicating things to your team, or do you tend to assume that they already know that they're doing a good job? Everyone likes to hear that they're doing a good job every now and again. So sometimes it's about just incorporating that into your communications. This is just a slide on some important questions to consider. And these are some of the questions that you might want to just ask yourself to just check in really and see how you're supporting your teams, and whether there's areas there that perhaps you could offer more support or find out more information. So ask yourself, do you truly understand the needs of your employees? And if you don't, how are you going to find out? Are you going to conduct one-to-ones? Are you using that as an opportunity to find out really what they need? Do you do surveys? Do you use team meetings? Do you regularly offer positive feedback to your team outside of formal appraisals? As we said, it's really important to have a bit more regular feedback, and sometimes appraisals, you know, they're once every month or once every quarter, but what happens in between those appraisals? Do I need to make any reasonable adjustments? This is going to be particularly important for people that are considering a return to the office. You can't just assume that everyone is going to be happy with coming back, and they might not come back at full time. And I think listening to what a lot of employers are talking about with the return to work, it generally seems like everyone is being really flexible, and people have the opportunity to decide how they do it. But I think one of the things here as a manager is just thinking about what impact are you having on your team. So you might be deciding to go in every day or 3 or 4 days a week, but have you made it clear that you're not expecting your employees to do the same? Or if you are, what the reasons for that are? And if you are there any individuals that potentially don't feel comfortable with that? And do you need to make any reasonable adjustments to that? It's just about accommodating people. Does my team have learning and development opportunities? Again, this is what we talked about earlier. You know, what training is available? Is someone wanting to get some mentoring off you? If you don't have the opportunity to do that, how can you facilitate that in another way? Do my employees feel their work is meaningful? This is quite an important question, because we know that work provides meaning. And this isn't just in this current period of time, but I imagine that for a lot of people, you know, COVID has been an opportunity to kind of reflect on your life and what you're doing. And for some people, it might have created a bit of a question mark around, well, is what I'm doing actually meaningful? How am I contributing to public welfare or health and safety? So it might just be worth checking in with your teams, especially in your one-to-ones, about, you know, what meaning do they get from their work? Do they feel motivated by it? Do they feel like they have purpose? Do they understand how the work that they do contributes to the overall goals of the organisation? These are all really, really key factors that influence employee engagement, well-being, productivity, and so on. Do my employees have adequate resources? And when we say resources, we're not just talking about money, we're not just talking about technology, but it's also things like time and support and information. All of these things will help to balance out the kind of demands and resources scale, and that is so important. And even if you don't have the resources like time and technology or information, support is going to be something that will bring that balance up, and that's where you have a big impact. Is my team working towards a collective vision and goals? Obviously, this is going to be slightly different if you've got fairly standalone teams and employees, but generally speaking, this is about the attitudes and the beliefs of the team in general, feeling like they are one and that they're all working towards a particular goal. Because if that's not aligned, then it can cause conflict. Does my team work well together? So how do they communicate? Are you the one that's always having to encourage team meetings or team catch-ups, or is that something that they can do themselves as well? Do my employees feel comfortable asking me for help? You might feel like you're approachable, but we know that generally people are less inclined to ask for help. So sometimes it's about you making the first move and being proactive. And finally, do I encourage mutual feedback? So what I mean by this is you are asking your employees to give you feedback on a lot of things. How are they feeling about their jobs? What goals have they got? How can what do they need from you? But sometimes what we miss as line managers is asking for feedback and giving it back ourselves. So if you're asking someone to share how they're feeling about a certain situation or information about their well-being, or be vulnerable with you, then you might find that there are barriers there. So one way is actually giving feedback yourself and sharing your own experiences to a degree. And do you give them the opportunity to give you feedback? So how are you performing as a manager? Is there anything that you can do to be helping them? And that's an uncomfortable question, because there might be things that come out of that we think, oh, I don't know how to respond to that, or I wasn't expecting it. But it's the best way that you can improve your ability as a line manager, is if you make it very clear that you are open to feedback as well, and that will really help to build those relationships. So now we're moving on to supporting the return to work. And this will be relative to people that are coming back from furlough, or for if you're moving back into a physical office environment. So some things to think about. Are rules and safety procedures clearly communicated? Just because you don't feel that worried about going back into a physical environment doesn't mean your team aren't. So it might sound really boring to talk about what the processes are on wearing face masks, or regular hand washing breaks, or things like that, but it's going to be important for some people. It's going to be very important for some people to feel comfortable like that. And also thinking about what's the process for if someone doesn't follow that procedure. There are going to be some people that don't really take it that seriously, so you've got to think about how that's going to impact the rest of the team, and what you will do about it. These rules and procedures, as I said, they might have been shared by the business, but have you made sure that each of your team members are aware of them? So just communication really is key here. Speak to each team member individually about their return. I understand that this is time consuming, but it's so important. So talking about phased return, are there certain days that work? Do they need flexibility with their working hours? Have they thought about travel and childcare arrangements? And if not, what are their thoughts on that, and how can work kind of support that? Are they feeling nervous? Have they got any particular worries? So all of these questions are going to be really important, and they will help you to understand how you can support your team better, or whether you need to ask your organisation to provide some further support. And have business updates been clearly communicated? So people if they've been on furlough and they're starting to come back, but your team is still on furlough, do your team have an idea of when they expect to come back, especially if redundancies are happening? It's going to be so important here to be really clear with your team, and just either instill confidence in them or be realistic about the situation. Because you also have to remember that if you genuinely are worried that some members in your team might get made redundant, obviously you're not necessarily expected to say, I'm worried about your job, but you've got to also have an element of clarity, because they need to get themselves prepared, and they need to start thinking about that if it's inevitable or if it's likely to happen. Because what you wouldn't want to happen is for them to feel like they're completely fine and safe, and then all of a sudden they get told they're being made redundant. That is going to have a much more serious impact than if you are more transparent and clear with them. And actually they'll probably appreciate the honesty as well. So think about how you would want to be supported during if you were in the same position. So just some things that I put down as some options. So if you are bringing your team back into an office, could you meet them outside and take them in and walk them through the office and show them all of the changes that have happened? Do this maybe as a team, because it will help people to feel like they are being supported, like they're in this together, like there are no nasty surprises, and it shows your dedication as a manager. We've had a couple of organisations that we're working with say that they've done this, and it's been really welcomed, and it's just a really small thing, but I imagine that your employees would really, really appreciate it, and it's just a nice gesture. Host a virtual team meeting to air any concerns or worries, including your own. So, you know, if you've got a team that are on furlough or are returning to the workplace, have a catch up beforehand, and just use it as an opportunity to talk about, you know, what are you feeling nervous about? Is there anything that you're not sure of that I can find out for you? And make sure that this isn't work related. So obviously it's about returning to a workplace, but it's nothing to do with how this is going to impact their ability to do their job. It's more about how they're feeling about returning to work or coming back into this environment. It's got to be seen as a really caring meeting, as opposed to one where potentially they could be picked up for not following suit, for example. And have individual catch-ups with each member to find out how you can support them. You should be doing this anyway, but particularly with people that are returning from furlough, this is going to be important. You know, if they've been off for a few weeks or even a few months, for a lot of people, they've had to adjust. And, you know, work does provide a lot of meaning. It provides structure and a purpose and routine. And if they've not had that, then you know, going back to that so quickly is probably going to be a bit overwhelming. It's going to be nerve-wracking. If people have been off for, you know, 4 or 5 months, then how confident do they feel coming back? They might feel like things have changed, and are they going to be able to do their job in the same way that they were before? So that's important. I've just had a raised hand. Did someone want to? You feel free to unmute yourself and talk if you had a question, or it might have been a mistake. I think I've permitted everyone to talk now, so if you do want to unmute yourself and ask a question or say something, please feel free, but I will continue on because that might have been a mistake. All right, so how we actually optimize leadership skills. Challenge 1 is visibility. So ensure your team know how and when you can be contacted. This is just as simple as clearly communicating your working hours. So are there particular times in the day where you're more available for spontaneous catch-ups? So if someone wants to give you a ring or they have a quick question they need to ask you, is there a particular time in the day that works for you? Promote video conferencing wherever possible. I think a lot of people are doing this, but I've certainly noticed with a few clients that some people are reluctant to put their video on, and that is okay. But I think as a manager, just modeling that to start with, and putting your camera on and encouraging people to do that as well if they feel comfortable, it just gives access to those kind of behavioural and emotional cues, and can really help with how you support your team, and also how they interact with each other. Schedule regular catch-ups with your team, and this shouldn't be about work. This should be informal catch-ups. And it shouldn't be seen under the guise of micromanagement or performance management, because it's got to be a space where you can talk about things that aren't work related. And challenge 2, flexible leadership styles. So individual and circumstantial differences are going to require different leadership skills. We were on a focus group the other day, and one manager said that she had a particular person in her team that wasn't doing that well. They weren't performing very well, and it was very difficult to performance manage or support them in a virtual environment. So some people are going to require more time and effort and more communication than others. So it's going to be about balancing that, and you're not expected to get it right first time, and it's probably going to be challenging, but that's where these regular catch-ups and one-to-ones can really help, and asking your employees for feedback on what kind of level of support and management do they think they need. They're adults at the end of the day, so they should be able to tell you what they need from you. I put the difference between transformational and transactional leadership. One inspires to motivate, which is transformational leadership, and the other motivates, rewards to motivate. So transactional leaders will reward people with things like money or praise or time off or something like that. So physical reward of some description, whatever that might be, as a way of motivating people. And that is effective in some environments, it is, and sometimes in virtual environments it's more effective. But transformational leadership, as hopefully all of you know, is where it is the most motivational, and this is where you get kind of long-lasting impacts. So kind of successful leaders are those skilled in making the right decisions and also providing reassurance through a balanced mix of optimism, saying things like, we can do this, but also realism regarding the future. So for example, these are challenging times ahead, but I believe we can succeed. But there's some research that refers to management skills known as charisma, which essentially they do require training and domain expertise to build those skills, but essentially what they are is a combination of characteristics, part of which involve being clear communicators and communicating a shared vision and goal to your employees, but also being realistic about situations and not kind of pulling the wool over people's eyes. And it's going to be important to make sure that you have opportunities for professional development. So this might be something that you want to talk to your managers about, or your employees about. Is there anything that you particularly feel that you want to build on your own skills to support your team? Reward and recognition is another challenge. So how are employees going to be rewarded and recognised for the work they do? And this is what we kind of touched on earlier. So you might want to think about having clear structures for reporting work if necessary, but also making sure that you do have those performance appraisals as well. And they might need to be slightly more regular, because you've got to be able to be in a situation where you can give feedback to your employees and tell them how they're doing and give them the right kind of opportunities and rewards, whether that's through learning and development or just through positive feedback or promotions even. But have a think about how that will translate, especially if you're used to doing it in a physical environment. How is that going to translate to a virtual one? Ensure regular conversations about personal and professional development. Think about personal development plans. They're a really, really good way of setting goals for people. And sometimes people need a bit of encouragement to do this because they might not even know what their goals are. But that's your role as well as a line manager, to really get them thinking about what actually are their big goals and what sort of smaller goals do they need to achieve in order to reach that big goal. So this can be a really good way of structuring a conversation, especially maybe if you've got a newer team member or you don't have as good a relationship with them. Just really getting back to basics and starting with kind of goal setting also gives them an opportunity to work towards something that is outside of necessarily the team's or the organisational goals. Can you provide mentoring or support your team members to find a mentor? You might not have the time or resources to really invest in your team and provide those kind of mentoring opportunities, but it's important for some people. So how are you going to make sure that they have those opportunities? And you might need to speak to HR or about a learning and development budget. Obviously, each organisation will have different budgets and rules on this, and there might be loads of opportunities, but there also might be limited ones. So, you know, could you talk to your organisation about potentially increasing that budget or finding more opportunities? And there are loads of free resources now that people can join onto. Things like this, for example, are a development opportunity and something to just refresh your skills. And then when we talk about mass layoffs and redundancies, obviously this is going to be inevitable for a lot of industries, unfortunately, but it's important to properly manage and support remaining staff. So, you know, we've worked with a couple of organisations that have gone through a mass redundancy as a result of this. And some have dealt with it really well, and others are more, they don't really necessarily appreciate what effect that is going to have on the people that are remaining there. So don't just assume that people will feel lucky to be here. A lot of people will feel uncertain. They'll feel potentially they won't trust their employer anymore. They might not feel as motivated. There's a lot of research from mass layoffs showing that there tends to be lower levels of organisational commitment, involvement in your job, and a greater stress among remaining employees. So it's just an important consideration. So one thing you could do is promote reflective practice. And this is something that is implemented in a lot of settings, but mainly kind of care settings, or sort of environments where people are exposed to potentially traumatic events like the police force or healthcare or the ambulance service, for example. If someone sees something or something happens, a critical incident, they'll have a debrief. And it's something that can work really well in every kind of organisational setting. So a mass layoff or a mass load of redundancies is a critical incident, and it's going to impact people. So try and promote this reflective practice and use it as an opportunity to debrief. So have a team meeting or have a focus group with people. Allow them to share their feelings, share your own feelings and your concerns, and it should not be work focused. This should just be people sharing their feelings about a certain event and reflecting on it and having that kind of peer review and peer support. So it shouldn't be talking about how is this going to impact my ability to do my job, for example. So if anyone's interested, you can search reflective practice, and there'll be a lot of information on it and how you can how it's used. But it's a really, really, really good way of building team morale and just getting feedback from people. So promoting conversations to improve well-being. This is our kind of final bit. Similarly to reflective practice happens after particular events have occurred. But outside of that, you want to try and encourage informal chats that don't have any involvement in work whatsoever. And it might not be appropriate for you to get involved in that, and that's fine. You know, you might not feel like you want to necessarily get involved in that, but encouraging your team to do that. You know, have things like virtual tea or coffee breaks. Some organisations or some teams I know have done kind of mental health talks or Friday drop-ins where people just come in and they join on and they just have a chat about anything other than work. And it allows people to build relationships that don't involve work, and you slowly start seeing people start to share more about themselves and about their lives, and that's when you start to see people feeling more open to opening up about whether they're struggling with something. Mutual sharing is important, as I said earlier. If you're expecting your employees to be vulnerable and tell you about things that are causing them stress or things that they're struggling with, then it's got to be mutual. Obviously, you don't need to tell everyone everything and air all of your personal feelings or experiences, but having some element of just human behavior and just saying, like, I'm struggling with this at the moment. This is what I'm finding really, really stressful. How do you feel? It just brings that kind of relationship into more of an equal level. You can use focus groups as well. This is a similar thing to reflective practice, but focus groups are a really, really good way of just checking in and getting people's opinions on things. If it's around management, sometimes you might not have the relationship there, so sometimes a focus group is best run by someone else in the team as kind of a team focus group, or an external person or someone in wellbeing or HR, for example, that can mediate it. But it's really just a confidential opportunity to talk about opinions, share feelings, and then use some of that information to help guide practices and strategies. We use focus groups whenever we are looking at developing interventions and strategies for organisations, because you might have an idea that something's a good idea, but when you actually start talking to your employees, they might pick it apart and say that's ridiculous. So it's actually a really good method that you can use. So maybe having a focus group with people about how they found the past few months, or how they're feeling about returning to work or working in a virtual environment now. You'll find a lot of people will be willing to talk, I think, and it'll be quite insightful. You can also conduct a stress risk assessment. You do not have to be a health and wellbeing specialist to do this, and it doesn't have to be intensive, but the HSC has a really, really good information on work-related stress, and they identify 6 key pressures, essentially, or 6 key things that contribute to work-related stress. either positively or negatively. Those are job demands, level of control and autonomy, the support role, as in, are they clear in their jobs? Do they know what's expected of them? The relationships, and also change management. So HSE does have a stress indicator tool. It's 35 questions. You can do it in a paper format, or you could do it online. But it doesn't have to be that extensive. You could just ask some simple questions, pick a couple from there that look at demands of someone's job, the level of control they have in their work, what kind of support they have, are they clear on their role, the relationships and change. But it's a really good way of kind of temperature checking with your team. Encourage the use of wellness action plans. If no one's heard of that before, it's essentially a practical tool that you can use, and it's really good at guiding conversations if you don't have that relationship with with a member of staff. Having a wellness action plan essentially asks them what things cause them stress, what things help them at work, what if they are feeling not that great, what can a manager do to support them, or what things help them. It's a really good way of structuring a conversation, and also gives them a bit of a plan to put in place. So either you could do that with them, or encourage your team individually to complete a wellness action plan. Mind have a very good resource, and they've got lots of information on what it's for, how you use it. And then finally, know what support options are available. So make sure that you are aware what options are available to your employees, whether it is your EAP, whether it's private medical insurance, whether it's Thrive, whether you've got online counselling, whatever it might be. Know what options are available. Your role as the line manager is to signpost and not to advise. Obviously, within reason, if things are work related, and you have an element of control, you can offer advice, and there might be areas where you can provide support and adjustments where necessary. But when it comes to, for example, personal issues or issues outside of the workplace that's impacting someone's mental health and well-being, we are not clinicians, so you need to make sure that you're able to confidently signpost them to the right level of support, but not advise them on what they should be doing, because that can actually exacerbate things and make things worse. So thank you everyone for listening to this webinar. I hope you found it useful. We have got a few minutes, a bit of time for Q&A, so please feel free to drop questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and I will get round to them. But if you don't have any questions, thank you very much for your time today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Friday and weekend.